As Inga said, I'm a psychologist. I'm also a coach and consultant. And I've been working in the IT field for about 6 years or so, mostly in IT recruitment. So I'm not an agile professional, but I'm someone who works with people who interact with agile daily. And the people I tend to help with most of the time are software developers. And when I say software developers, I don't mean only engineers. I mean all the people who belong to a Scrum team in a general sense. And I happen to be also a researcher, so I do psychological studies, and I had a great opportunity to look at how Agile improves, or not necessarily, the well-being of software developers. And the reason why this topic is important to me is because throughout my career, while talking to people who work in the IT area, I noticed that there are certain challenges they face in terms of burnout, in terms of social anxiety, and I felt that I want to help. I want to create the biggest value to them. So this is my introduction. So I'll just share my screen so that you could see my slides. Okay. And the topic is well-being of software developers, where Agile meets the road. So I guess many of you heard of the phrase where rubber meets the road, which basically means when the car goes on the road and it actually is working. So my hypothesis is that well-being is the core concept which works at the back end of many Agile practices. And I will argue for that in my presentation. So first of all, I would like to remind us of the Agile Manifesto, and specifically the first value, which says that individuals and interactions should be valued more than processes and tools. And what I noticed while working in the IT field, I realized that maybe Agile people, or we in general, we have been focusing too much on the interaction, too much on the team, too much on the communication, and we forgot the individual who has one's feelings, has one's thoughts, and oftentimes we don't have a chance to get into that world and see how that individual feels or what it's like to be that individual. So I would like to focus our attention now on the individuals and see what's going on in their heads and what research shows. And the first question I'm interested the most is the mental health. So when you're not feeling well emotionally, maybe you're feeling depressed, maybe you're feeling down, of course, it affects your performance. And not always we notice that when we go to work. Now, when we connect to various programs, Teams or Slack or whatever, we don't necessarily realize how our colleagues feel or what it's like to be in their shoes. So I wanted to understand globally what it's like to feel, to be a software developer, to be more objective. And I decided to look at the Stack Overflow survey, a very major survey done year after year. And what's great about this survey is that they have several questions about mental health. And I have been following this survey for quite a while, and I noticed a trend. That the mental health of software developers was not going up, it was decreasing actually. And the reason I feel that this data is important is because it covers a lot of people. So first of all, we are talking about samples of 80,000, 100,000 participants. Most of them, of course, they are engineers, they are developers. We're talking about a cohort that, software is done mostly by engineers, whereas others are contributing to that as well. But the survey covers many more people, product owners, analysts, and DevOps people, and many more. So first of all, important thing, we're talking about different groups, not only engineers. We're talking about mostly about professionals. 70% of people who participated, let's say this year, these are professionals. So it's not students. Many times academic studies focus too much on students. That is not the case. And we're talking about people that are from all around the world. Of course, most of them are from the States, but not necessarily from India, from Germany, from UK, and many other tech hubs. So this slide is just for you to realize the scope of the study. And if we look at this graph, we will realize that from 2018, the mood disorders like depression and bipolar and anxiety disorders, if you look at a trend line, it has been going up. On one hand, it's because of COVID, right? On the other hand, maybe it depends on the specific sample. But from all the people who participated in the survey, let's say from those 100,000 people, right? At least about, let's say in 2018, 12,000 people answered the question about mental health. And from those 12,000, about 8% noticed that they are suffering from mood disorders like depression and bipolar and anxiety. And of course, we can argue, is this self-diagnosed? Is this diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist? We don't know. But one thing is clear, that these people, they feel that they are suffering. And we can't even imagine about the remaining part that did not answer this question. But still, we see that the problem is rising. And when we compare these results with the general population, and this is important, guys, we realize that these numbers are almost 2 times higher. And this was actually maybe the main reason why I decided to focus on this cohort, to decide to be, how to say, psychologist for tech people, because I realized that I want to make an impact, I want to help. And I see that there's a problem. So this was the first sparkle, the first maybe motivation that encouraged me to look deeper. And as someone who is working in the field, who's doing studies, who's looking at various researchers, I realized that it's not just that the mental health is, it's not the best one. It has effects. It has very down-to-earth effects on the product, on the team. So when people are suffering, so research by Daniel Graziotin, one of the front runners in the area of human aspects of software engineering, his research shows that products delay, people deviate from the process. So essentially, if you use Scrum, it's not used in the best way possible. The code quality is not the best one. There are discharges of code. There are breaks in the flow. So these are like one of the major reasons that affect the product. So that's not good. So if we realize that, let's say 1 out of 10 software developers are suffering psychologically, maybe Agile can help. And this was the question I asked, maybe Agile can help. And I wanted to understand what is the relationship. So I'll tell you briefly about the study that I did about 2 years ago. The problem I wanted to solve, of course, academically, was that there are not a lot of studies on that. There were not a lot of studies. I wanted to correct the record. And what I actually studied, I decided to study not necessarily mental health, because you won't go to your organization and ask, oh guys, so how much depression do you feel? Now, of course, you won't get a lot of honest answers. So when you are doing such things in organizations, you have to decide to find workarounds, to measure other things that will give you a sign of the mental health or maybe well-being in general about the team. And the 2 constructs I studied were engagement and team planning. So I will explain a little bit later what do they mean. And how I studied, I did surveys. So psychologists do surveys. We give questionnaires and we expect that people will self-report honestly. Of course, we have our techniques to go around various biases. And questions are like, on a scale from 1 to 7, let's say, how often do you experience this and that emotion? So this is how we go about. And the analysis I did was correlational analysis. So basically, I looked at the relationship between variables. So if, let's say, one variable goes up, let's say the use of a certain Agile practice, we have hypothesis that maybe another variable like engagement will go up as well. Okay. And I collected data, as I said, about 2 years ago. Okay, so how I measured Agile? That's, I guess, one of the most golden questions. So I used a questionnaire that is called perceptive Agile measurement. And the scientists, what they did, they decided that, okay, so agility is demonstrated by certain practices, by the presence of certain practices. And their hypothesis is that the more frequently, let's say, you use certain practices, agile practices, the more, let's say, the team is agile, or the organization is agile. So we have practices like continuous integration and testing, co-location, customer acceptance test, customer access, iterative development, iteration planning, retrospectives, and stand-up meetings. And these are measured by certain statements that, as I said, people then they measure. Let's say if there's a statement, developers had the most recent version of code available, you, let's say, choose from 1 to 7, how often that is being done, okay? So this is how Agile was measured. And when we talk about team engagement and team climate, we also have certain dimensions that are measured by certain statements. So this is how I decided to study well-being. So when it comes to engagement, I looked at dedication, I looked at immersion or flow, and vigor or energy. And when it comes to team climate, I looked at safety, psychological safety, I looked at support for innovation, task orientation, and vision orientation. The sample was about 143 software developers from about 21 Agile team from about 11 organizations. So it's quite a lot, to be honest. You can imagine that to get business organizations to participate was not easy. So we got on board people from fintech sector, from IoT, from IT services, software development. And if we talk about demography, so most of the organizations were small. So from about 11 to 50 employees or from 51 to 200. So there were not a lot of corporations, okay? So you can imagine that with those organizations, Agile looks different. Maybe they didn't feel to participate because, you know, I send emails to many organizations. So I try to be as objective as possible. The sample, many people. So of course, many software engineers, team leads participated, scrum masters, product owners, engineering managers, quality assurance people, Agile coaches. So this is like the sample. And just for your interest, according to the participants, the most often used methodologies were Scrum, Kanban, some Lean, and some even extreme programming. So this was a question that people were able to choose. Okay. So what are the results? So just to give you an understanding that these teams were Agile. So I transformed the results into a scale from 0 to 100%. So of course, the most frequently used practices were stand-up meetings, iteration planning, or sprints, iterative development. Less used were customer acceptance tests, basically getting approval by the client to move forward, to continue working on the product, retrospectives, co-location. Okay, so if you ask the question, if these teams like were perfect Agile teams, not necessarily, but they were using Agile practices, that's for sure. And when we talk about engagement, the engagement scores that work relatively high. So if let's say we talk about high engagement, a very high engagement goes from 75 to 100% according to the methodology. So they're relatively engaged teams, right? But when it comes to safety, not necessarily. We see that the teams they are languishing, but not necessarily flourishing. They're doing okay, but not doing to the best of their ability. So we see that some lack of support for innovation, maybe some lack of orientation toward the task, but more orientation towards the vision. And what I did, I looked at correlations. And unfortunately, what I realized, if those who remember statistics, you'll realize that a strong correlation is, so basically we measure correlation from 0 to 1. So of course, if you get 0, you get like identical variables. So you don't want to get that. But a strong correlation is from about, in psychology, from about 0.6 or to 0.7. Unfortunately, the correlations were small. And I found only correlations between team climate and continuous integration and testing, and team climate and co-location. When it comes to engagement, I didn't find, unfortunately, significant results. So what does it mean? It means that regardless of how often we use Agile practices, it has no relationship with team engagement. So in other words, there are many other variables that affect this. and it's not agile practices. When it comes to team climate, it depends on the practice. And we won't go deep into this slide, but I provided you some tips when it comes to safety, when it comes to team climate. What should you do to maybe improve that team climate? And when we go deeper into the team climate, to the dimensions like vision, task, innovation, psychological safety, we realize that we have to increase certain practices like continuous testing and integration or co-location. And we have to reduce certain practices like focusing, like including too much the client, because too much customer does not help when it comes to the safety of the team. Of course, we don't have a lot of time, so I won't spend too much. And again, if you want to make your team feel more engaged, so don't focus too much on Agile. We need other things. So going to the end, so if let's say the impact of Agile is limited, so what could be the alternative, right? What can we do otherwise? And this is why I did another study. And after that study, I looked at many different studies. So I did a systematic review. I wanted to see what other studies show and what are the main trends. And from these trends, I looked at 31 studies that studied the well-being of more than 10,000 software developers. And I developed a model. I developed a model of software developers' well-being. And the model looks like this. So if you want to improve the well-being of people, of your teams, and there are 3 aspects of their well-being. This eudaimonic well-being, which talks about their core psychological needs, like autonomy, competence, and relatedness. If you want to increase their hedonic well-being or satisfaction, and you want to make them engaged and inflow or multidimensional well-being, certain factors have to be ensured. So individual factors, so they have to have proper mental health, high motivation, they have to have proper personality, and of course, organizational factors where usually Agile focuses mostly, like certain job characteristics, like, for example, autonomous work, like, for example, interesting tasks, team characteristics like safety, clear norms, everyone understands what they're doing, and workplace characteristics like pay, career opportunities. And these things, they contribute to the satisfaction. And what's the outcome? The outcome that you get proper health of individuals and proper organizational health. So you get committed individuals, you get highly performing individuals and productive individuals. So this is like the main idea. You see that my time is running out. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go deeper into this model. I provided at the end of my presentation certain recommendations. What can you do to help improve your team's well-being? So first of all, get a nuanced understanding of their psychological makeup. Look at their personality traits, using maybe Big 5. Look at their motivation, what motivates them, maybe career, maybe work-life balance. Ensure if you realize what are they feeling, what is their mental health, do they experiencing anxiety, they're experiencing burnout. So this is like nuanced understanding of their psychological makeup. Measure their well-being. There are different aspects of well-being and all are important. Research shows that you have to be multidimensional. You cannot focus too much on one aspect like satisfaction or let's say autonomy. You have to be multidimensional. And finally, balance team interventions with individual psychological support. So ensure proper opportunities to get coaching, individual coaching for skill development and goal achievement. Provide proper counseling for their mental health and provide even opportunities maybe for psychotherapy to understand themselves better and maybe get better coping skills. So one is maybe for short term, the other for the long term. So
I have one question in the chat.
So just one sentence. So the moral is simple. Let's focus on the individual. Let's first focus on ourselves. Let's work on ourselves. And this will have a positive impact on our teams and eventually on our organizations. So that would be it.
Yeah, so you have one question actually very much related with your last slide. So how do you keep the team motivated after hundreds of completed sprints? Routine of sprints can become boring and their engagement falls.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I would have to understand the exact situation. My intuition is that maybe people are not happy about the product they are working on. If you don't believe in the product, if you don't care about the product, if you're not interested in the product, if you have things on your mind that you care more, like your mental health, of course that you will get fed up. It's human nature. So this is my first hunch where the problem might lie, but of course we would need to talk and dig deeper.
And where do you think the general well-being is better, in bigger organizations or smaller ones, or medium?
I guess in all organizations it's important, but especially in bigger ones where maybe we have a tendency to lose the pulse of each individual. Because when we are working in a small team, it's much easier to experience the emotions. So there's like a emotional contagion theory that says that emotions are spread, and we don't necessarily have to talk about them to feel them. But when you're working in big organizations, things are lost in departments and hierarchies, and we don't get the objective understanding. So there's more work to do for big organizations, I guess.
Last question from Laura for this topic. Is there a correlation between the mental health state and the developer's seniority? Is that something that accumulates?
I have not studied that, actually. I would not necessarily state that there's like a direct relationship, but I would say that more senior people are more wise and they are more resilient. They have seen more, they've done more, and for them it's maybe more easier to cope. On one hand, on the other hand, there's another problem when maybe more senior people, they still have doubts about working with their mental health, and they tend to repress, not to talk about their feelings, not to work on their feelings, which is totally different with the younger generation. So most of the time that people come to me, they are different people, but mostly, for example, younger generation, because they feel that they can do something about it, whereas maybe more senior people are more skeptical and maybe more independent. So it's an interesting question. It would be interesting to dig deeper.
Okay, thank you, Pavel.